One moment they were filming a war movie. The next moment, real authorities were making arrests. How does a movie set turn into a situation where soldiers end up in handcuffs? Across several productions, massive explosions, real military vehicles, and thousands of uniformed extras blurred the line between fiction and reality so badly that police and military forces believed something dangerous was actually happening. Some crews were detained, some soldiers were arrested, and one production nearly triggered a military crisis. The Bridge on the River Kwai, 1957. Few war films in history look as authentic as The Bridge on the River Kwai. That realism came at a strange cost. During production in Sri Lanka, the filmmakers built a massive wooden railway bridge across a jungle river. Thousands of locals, soldiers, and extras moved through the area wearing military uniforms from World War II. From a distance, it did not look like a movie set. Villagers nearby believed a real military force had appeared in the jungle. Some reported armed soldiers marching near the river and carrying rifles through nearby settlements. Local police responded quickly. Several military personnel working as extras were temporarily detained when authorities discovered uniformed men moving outside the controlled filming area. The confusion stemmed from the production's decision to use extremely realistic props and uniforms. To outsiders, the scene looked like a genuine wartime operation. For a few tense hours, the line between filmmaking and military activity completely disappeared. The Green Berets, 1968. When the Green Berets began filming, the United States military was already deeply involved in Vietnam. The production relied heavily on real bases, real soldiers, and real equipment. That level of authenticity created an unexpected problem. During filming at military training facilities, soldiers assisting the production often moved between active base operations and movie scenes. In some cases, they wore uniforms or carried equipment that closely resembled operational gear. Security officers began noticing unusual activity. Soldiers were seen escorting civilian camera crews across restricted zones, transporting equipment between filming areas, and occasionally stepping outside authorized locations while still in costume. Military police eventually intervened. A few soldiers helping the film crew were detained for violating base security procedures. The issue was not the film itself, but the blurred line between training operations and cinematic staging. For the military command overseeing the base, maintaining strict control of personnel and equipment was essential. Hollywood realism had collided directly with real military protocol. The Longest Day, 1962. Recreating the D-Day invasion required scale that few films had ever attempted. The Longest Day used thousands of extras, including real soldiers from several European armies. Massive beach landings were staged using authentic uniforms, landing craft, artillery pieces, and explosives. The result looked astonishingly real. So real that problems began when some extras moved beyond the filming zone while still dressed as German troops. In one incident during production in France, several soldiers hired as extras left the set while still wearing full German uniforms and carrying prop weapons. To nearby civilians, the sight was alarming. Local police were called. Authorities quickly stopped the group and questioned them about their presence. Seeing armed men in enemy uniforms decades after the war triggered immediate concern. Only after filmmakers arrived to explain the situation were the men released. The incident highlighted the strange challenge of historical filmmaking. When realism becomes convincing enough, it can cause panic among people who cannot distinguish a movie scene from something far more serious. For a moment, the ghosts of World War II seemed to return. Kelly's Heroes, 1970. Filming Kelly's Heroes required something most war movies rarely have access to: real tanks. The production worked with the Yugoslav army, which provided armored vehicles and soldiers to appear on screen. Columns of tanks moved through rural areas during filming, recreating World War II battles. But outside the controlled filming zones, the sight of moving armor created confusion. During one day of shooting, several tanks and military vehicles were relocated between locations. Reports began circulating among local authorities that an unidentified armored convoy was moving through the region. Security forces responded quickly. Some of the soldiers assisting the film were temporarily detained, while officials investigated whether the vehicles were authorized military movements. The confusion came from the scale of the production. To observers unfamiliar with the filming schedule, the tanks appeared to be part of a real military exercise. Once authorities confirmed the situation, the soldiers were released and filming resumed. Yet the episode demonstrated something remarkable about war cinema. When hundreds of troops, real armored vehicles, and battlefield explosions appear together in open countryside, the result can look less like entertainment and more like the beginning of an actual military operation. Apocalypse Now, 1979. Few productions in film history descended into chaos quite like Apocalypse Now. Filming took place in the Philippines with heavy support from the Philippine military. Helicopters, soldiers, and equipment were loaned to the production to create massive combat scenes. But those same resources were also being used for real military operations. At various points during filming, helicopters assigned to the movie would suddenly leave the set to respond to insurgent activity elsewhere in the country. That overlap between filmmaking and real conflict created constant confusion. In one reported incident, soldiers assisting the production were detained by military police after moving equipment and prop weapons away from the filming zone during curfew hours. To authorities patrolling the region, armed personnel transporting military equipment after dark raised immediate suspicion. The situation was quickly clarified once commanders confirmed the soldiers were part of the film production. Still, the moment captured the strange reality of Apocalypse Now. While actors performed scripted combat scenes for the cameras, the soldiers supporting them were sometimes operating in the middle of an actual war zone. On that set, the distance between cinema and reality was dangerously thin. Platoon, 1986. Oliver Stone's Platoon aimed to recreate the Vietnam War with brutal realism. The cast underwent an intense military-style training program in the jungles of the Philippines before filming began. Real soldiers and local military personnel assisted the production throughout the shoot, but the environment was unpredictable. Large groups of uniformed men carrying rifles moved through jungle terrain that was not always clearly separated from nearby military operations. At one point during the production, several soldiers working alongside the crew were stopped and detained by military police after leaving their assigned posts to assist with filming logistics. To security officers responsible for the region, soldiers moving outside authorized zones while armed raised immediate concerns. The detentions were brief. Once commanders confirmed the individuals were assisting a film production, the situation was resolved quickly. However, the incident reflected the unusual scale of the project. Platoon did not simply simulate combat from a distance. The production placed actors, crew members, and soldiers directly inside dense jungle environments that looked almost identical to real wartime terrain. From a security perspective, distinguishing between a movie shoot and a military exercise became surprisingly difficult. For those involved, the experience reinforced just how convincing the illusion of war could become. Saving Private Ryan, 1998. The opening sequence of Saving Private Ryan remains one of the most realistic battle scenes ever filmed. To recreate the Normandy invasion, the production employed hundreds of soldiers from the Irish Defense Forces as extras. They played both Allied troops and German defenders during the massive beach assault. The scale of the operation was extraordinary. Uniformed soldiers moved across beaches while explosions detonated around them. Landing craft delivered waves of troops as machine gun fire echoed across the shoreline. In the middle of that chaos, an unusual problem emerged. Some soldiers left the filming area while still wearing German uniforms and carrying prop rifles used during the battle sequences. To nearby observers, the sight was alarming. Local authorities quickly stopped the group and began questioning them. Armed men dressed as enemy soldiers moving through public areas triggered immediate suspicion. The misunderstanding was resolved once production officials confirmed the situation. The soldiers were part of the film's massive recreation of D-Day. Still, the incident highlighted something remarkable about the production. The scenes were staged with such accuracy that even outside the camera's frame, the illusion remained convincing. For a moment, modern authorities found themselves confronting what looked like an enemy patrol from 1944. Jarhead. 2005. Jarhead explored the psychological tension of soldiers waiting for combat during the Gulf War. To recreate the desert environment, the production filmed in locations across the American Southwest and used military advisors and consultants to maintain realism. Those advisors often transported uniforms, weapons, and other equipment between training areas and filming zones. During one production day, several individuals connected with the film were stopped at a civilian checkpoint while moving prop weapons through the region. From the perspective of local authorities, the situation appeared suspicious. Vehicles carrying military gear and uniformed personnel were traveling through civilian roads without the usual documentation associated with official military transport. Officers detained the group briefly while verifying their identities and confirming the equipment was part of a film production. Once the paperwork was clarified, the individuals were released and filming continued. Although the situation was resolved quickly, it illustrated a recurring problem for modern war films. When productions rely on extremely realistic equipment and military logistics, those materials must often move through real communities. To anyone unaware of the production schedule, the scene can look indistinguishable from actual military activity. And in environments where security concerns remain high, authorities rarely take chances. Black Hawk Down. 2001. When Ridley Scott began filming Black Hawk Down, the goal was simple: recreate the Battle of Mogadishu with overwhelming realism. The production moved to Morocco, where large sections of city streets were transformed into war-torn Somali neighborhoods. The military vehicles rolled through narrow roads while soldiers and stunt performers simulated intense urban combat. The scale of the operation was enormous. Convoys of Humvees and armored vehicles moved across the city during filming days, often escorted by armed personnel involved in the production. At one point, confusion erupted when a convoy left the designated filming zone and entered an area monitored by local authorities. From the outside, the scene looked dangerous. Armed men riding through the city in military vehicles immediately triggered security concerns. Moroccan officials quickly intervened and detained several soldiers assisting the production while they investigated the situation. To the authorities, the movement of heavily armed vehicles through civilian streets required immediate explanation. Once film officials clarified that the convoy was part of a controlled production shoot, the soldiers were released. Yet the incident revealed how convincing the film's realism had become. For a brief moment, the recreation of a chaotic urban battle looked so authentic that real security forces believed something far more serious might be unfolding. The Hurt Locker. 2008. When The Hurt Locker began filming, the production faced a challenge that every modern war film struggles with: how to recreate an active war zone without actually being in one. Director Catherine Bigelow chose Jordan as the primary filming location. Entire neighborhoods were transformed to resemble Baghdad streets, complete with military checkpoints, bomb disposal units, armored vehicles, and soldiers moving through tense urban environments. And the illusion was extremely convincing. Explosive ordnance disposal scenes required actors and military advisors to move through crowded streets wearing full combat gear. Prop weapons, armored trucks, and surveillance teams were used to simulate patrol operations. But that realism created a dangerous misunderstanding. At one point during production, several individuals connected to the film, including military extras carrying realistic rifles, moved outside the controlled filming zone while traveling between locations. Local authorities quickly noticed. Uniformed men carrying weapons in a civilian district immediately triggered a security response. Police detained the group while investigators determined whether the individuals were connected to a legitimate military operation. In a region where real security threats were common, the presence of armed personnel moving unpredictably could not be ignored. Production officials were quickly contacted. Once the film crew explained the situation and confirmed that the weapons were props used in filming, the detainees were released and production resumed. Still, the moment revealed a strange truth about modern war filmmaking. When a movie recreates conflict with enough precision, down to the uniforms, patrol movements, and tactical procedures, even trained authorities can struggle to distinguish cinema from reality. For a few tense hours, a fictional bomb disposal mission nearly became a real security incident. Tears of the Sun, 2003. Tears of the Sun set out to portray a fictional rescue mission during a violent African civil war. To achieve authenticity, the production relied heavily on military advisors and staged combat operations in dense jungle environments. The goal was immersion. Actors trained with military consultants, learning patrol formations, weapon handling, and battlefield communication. Helicopters transported troops through thick jungle canopies, while soldiers advanced through villages designed to resemble war-torn regions. But the realistic atmosphere occasionally created confusion outside the camera's view. During one stretch of filming, armed extras and advisors moved through a nearby region while transporting equipment between jungle locations. From a distance, the group looked exactly like an active military unit. Uniformed men carrying rifles were seen moving through terrain that local authorities believed was restricted. Concerned officials quickly responded and detained several individuals involved with the production. To security forces unfamiliar with the filming schedule, the presence of armed soldiers operating in the area raised serious questions. Were these troops part of a sanctioned military exercise, or something else entirely? The situation was clarified once production staff arrived and explained that the group was participating in a film shoot. The rifles were props, the uniforms were costumes. But in environments where political tensions and security concerns already existed, the distinction between fiction and reality can be dangerously thin. After confirming the details, authorities released the detained personnel and allowed filming to continue. The moment became one of several reminders that war films, especially those shot in remote locations, sometimes look too convincing for comfort. When soldiers move through jungles carrying rifles and communicating over radios, even trained observers can struggle to determine whether they are witnessing a movie scene or the beginning of a real conflict. Full Metal Jacket, 1987. Stanley Kubrick's Full Metal Jacket is famous for its meticulous realism, yet the film achieved that realism in an unusual way. Instead of filming in Vietnam, Kubrick transformed abandoned industrial areas in England into bombed-out city blocks that resembled war-torn Southeast Asia. Entire streets were rebuilt, debris scattered across ruined buildings, and hundreds of extras dressed in military uniforms filled the sets. From certain angles, the environment looked indistinguishable from an active war zone. During filming, groups of actors and reenactors frequently moved between locations wearing combat uniforms and carrying prop weapons used in battle scenes. For the production crew, it was simply another day of filming. For some observers outside the set, it looked far more alarming. At one point during the production, reports reached local authorities that armed men in military gear were moving through an abandoned industrial district. Police units responded. When officers arrived, they encountered individuals dressed as soldiers carrying rifles and moving through damaged buildings. The situation initially appeared suspicious. Were these people involved in a military exercise or something less official? And several individuals connected to the production were temporarily detained while police attempted to understand what was happening. The explanation turned out to be surprisingly simple. A film production was recreating the Vietnam War. Once officials confirmed that the weapons were props and the individuals were actors and crew members working under a legitimate production permit, the detainees were released. Filming resumed shortly afterward. Still, the incident reflected something remarkable about Kubrick's filmmaking style. His obsession with realism created environments so convincing that even people standing nearby sometimes forgot they were looking at a movie set. For a brief moment, the illusion worked too well, and authorities responded not to a film shoot, but to what appeared to be armed soldiers moving through a ruined battlefield in the middle of England. The Battle of Algiers, 1966. Few war films have ever blurred the boundary between cinema and real political conflict as dangerously as the Battle of Algiers. The film attempted something extremely unusual for its time. Director Gillo Pontecorvo wanted to recreate the Algerian War with such realism that audiences would feel as if they were watching actual historical footage. To achieve that effect, the production used handheld cameras, natural lighting, real locations in Algiers, and many non-professional actors, including people who had lived through the conflict themselves. Some participants were former resistance fighters. The result was astonishingly convincing. Crowds filled narrow streets while soldiers conducted raids, interrogations, and counterinsurgency operations. Explosions and street battles unfolded across neighborhoods that had experienced real violence only a few years earlier. To many observers, the scenes looked indistinguishable from reality. During filming, authorities occasionally responded to reports of armed men and large gatherings that resembled political unrest. Uniformed personnel moving through the streets and conducting what appeared to be military operations created serious concern among officials responsible for maintaining stability in the city. At various points, individuals involved in the production, including participants portraying fighters, were detained and questioned when authorities believed the gatherings might be connected to real political activity. For a country that had only recently emerged from a brutal war, such fears were understandable. The line between historical reenactment and political demonstration was dangerously thin. Production staff repeatedly had to explain that the scenes unfolding in the streets were part of a film project rather than a renewed insurgency. Once officials confirmed the nature of the production, the detainees were released and filming continued. But the atmosphere surrounding the project remained tense. Even after its release, the film's realism caused controversy worldwide. Governments debated whether the movie was political propaganda or historical documentation. Some countries banned it for years. Military academies later studied it as one of the most accurate depictions of urban insurgency ever captured on film. And perhaps that is the most remarkable part of the story. The film became so convincing that authorities sometimes reacted to it not as entertainment, but as if a real revolution might be unfolding in front of their eyes. For a war movie, there is no greater proof of realism than that. War movies promise realism, but sometimes that realism escapes the screen. Explosions become too convincing. Soldiers look too real. Entire cities begin to resemble active battlefields. And when that happens, authorities stop treating the scene like a movie. They treat it like a threat. These productions didn't just recreate war. For a moment, they accidentally triggered it.